This is a review of the 1971 Arthur Hiller film The Hospital, which stars George C. Scott, Diana Rigg, and was written by Paddy Chayefsky, who's a fairly widely admired screenwriter. He wrote the screenplay for the movie Network, as well as the movie Marty, and a whole bunch of things in between. You can see that's a long career. And who wrote some sort of, I think, particularly interesting and edgy, perhaps satirical or incisive sort of critical movies like Network, and to a lesser extent, The Hospital, which is a dark comedy like Network. It's a critique of American institution like Network, and it's kind of all over the place in some ways like Network. This movie is rated 7.2 on IMDb with just under 6,000 votes, and in some ways that's not too surprising. This movie is pretty interesting, though, and is at the very least a pretty good exemplar of movies in the 70s, or movies in any time, really, where there's a cultural divide that is trying to be contested by the film. In this case, I'm not sure if it is contested successfully, but without a doubt, questions about generational conflict, about change, about a mainstream America versus sort of a subversive younger America, shaped this film for better or for worse. So I think the clearest influence on this movie is not Network, but is actually MASH, which came out in 1970, 1 year before this hugely popular movie, quite different from the television show in a number of ways. I might make a video on that, different from the book too, in a couple of ways. MASH, of course, is about army surgeons at a mobile army surgical hospital. It's a dark comedy about doctors, but also has some sort of moments of intimate personal introspection. This movie is also set in a hospital, a non-mobile, non-army surgical hospital in New York City. It's actually a hospital that I have been to. And it mostly follows the chief surgeon, which is George C. Scott's character, who at the beginning of the film is struggling to find meaning in his work, which as a doctor, you would think surely this is one of the most meaningful careers, particularly as a chief surgeon, as somebody who's had a phenomenal medical career, somebody who trains like 80 new doctors a year and whatnot, puts them out into the world. Surely that would be a compelling and a meaningful job. But what we see is that not only has sort of the meaning, the day-to-day meaning of the job crumbled, but so has sort of the institution. So has the idea of health in general. In some ways, this is an anti-medical movie, which is a bizarre concept. There are very few movies, you will find very few movies out there that have the same viewpoint on hospitals. Now, on the surface, you can just look at how inept the doctors in this movie are, which is, in many ways, the point of the movie. So, as George C. Scott is contemplating this lack of meaning, as he's struggling to figure out why he's doing what he's doing and whatnot, his hospital is struck by a number of tragedies. Operations performed on the wrong patients and whatnot, the wrong operations performed, mistakes, fatal mistakes, cases where patients come in for routine checkups and end up in a coma and whatnot. But perhaps the strongest manifestation of all of this is the death or the severe injury of medical staff, which begins to happen at sort of an alarming rate and whatnot, which is kind of the ultimate corruption of the hospital, where not only are the patients suffering, which, of course, you're not supposed to do harm as a doctor, but beyond that, the institution itself seems to be sort of cannibalizing itself. The doctors themselves are going under the knife, sometimes accidentally and sometimes with disastrous results. Like I said, very rare to find this sort of a view of a hospital. Usually medical dramas are either eventually triumphant or they are tragic. We did all we could. We're the best in the world, but there's nothing we can do about this and whatnot. Well, in this movie, the doctors do not seem like the best in the world. And despite having a sort of a shining medical career and having world-class staff, supposedly, there are mistake after mistake after mistake that are made. So like I said, in some way, it's an anti-medical movie. To expand on that, in some ways, this is an anti-establishment movie, an anti-scientific movie, an anti-mainstream America movie. On the other hand, it's also an anti-subversive movie and whatnot, ridiculing, critiquing, satirizing a younger generation that maybe has different approaches and whatnot. I say that it's sort of an anti-medical movie and an anti-medical movie because this movie definitely does not stand for anything. You don't necessarily need to make a big claim as a film. It could be that the movie will sit back and just be observational and look at both sides and whatnot, but that's not really what this movie does. This is an edgy movie with prickly barbs at just about everyone that at the end of the day, for me, seems like it is not really on sure ideological footing. This movie is shaped for better or for worse by the cultural shift of the 1970s, right, and the late 60s. This is embodied, this is personified, I guess, by the two main characters in the movie. You've got George C. Scott, the unhappy surgeon in the traditional system, seeing the chaos, seeing the mistakes, seeing the errors, and Diana Rigg, who is the daughter of a patient. And Diana Rigg comes from sort of a back to the land, or her character has sort of a back to the land thing going on. She lives in Yuma, Arizona, I think, and she brings in a Native American healer to say a prayer for her father as he's ailing in the hospital. She wants to remove her father from the hospital as soon as she can and whatnot. And at first it might seem like the movie is sort of regressive because it ridicules this to some extent. But as it goes on, you'll actually see that the movie doesn't really know what the heck it's doing. And actually, that perspective is given some room to breathe to some extent, or at least it's given some room to sort of extend itself and to be revealed at a more extreme, to build on itself and whatnot. The movie is uneven, I think, is the number one thing I would say about this movie, which in some ways is not a bad thing, right? The movie MASH is uneven, for instance, in that it is sort of this comedy, this wartime medical comedy and whatnot. And this very similar vibes and whatnot. And so, dark comedy that's also going to be somewhat serious and personal, sure, that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. The movie is also uneven structurally in a couple of ways. So, for instance, the first third of the movie is relatively fast-paced. There's a lot of action. The main sort of dramatic thrust in this third is sort of piling on of more and more mistakes. So just as one error is sorted out, something else happens and whatnot. There's never really time to get things straightened out. There's never really time for George C. Scott to figure out, to solve his problems and whatnot. There's just an endless stream of more and more sort of calamities. That's the first third, and like I said, it's pretty fast-paced. The second third is basically one scene with two actors that is the third of the movie, or it feels like it at least. This is Diana Rigg and George C. Scott's character, and this part of the movie could basically be a play, two actors on a stage with monologues, essentially. I would say that these monologues are well-written and well-performed, and this is really, I think, a pretty strong part of the movie, but it's quite a shift from the beginning, and it's sort of odd. There's also a bit of a shift in the, not just sort of the structure, but also the genre to some extent. The first third of the movie is most similar to sort of MASH or something like that. But the next third almost starts feeling a little bit like Love Story, which Arthur Hiller directed 1 year before this movie came out and whatnot. Now, that said, it's a complicated and sort of weird version of Love Story. And this middle third, I think, could be somewhat polarizing. I think modern audiences in particular might not exactly like it, but you certainly can't deny that it's unpredictable and sort of interesting the way it goes. And I think the individual monologues are quite strong. Here, George C. Scott's character directly addresses the changing of the generations, generational conflict, and tries to reduce all of the other conflict. The protests that are going on by the Black Panthers at the hotel or at the hospital, because the hospital is expanding into a nearby housing project. Basically, there's a project that's getting torn down to expand the hospital and whatnot. So the Black Panthers are protesting and things. Meanwhile, there are just sort of general sort of Marxist protesters, and there are also, I think, anti-abortion protesters. Or no. These would be women's rights protesters who are or who are pro-choice. In some ways, these characters are all sort of ridiculed to some extent. George C. Scott in his monologue tries to reduce that all to a general sort of generational conflict as some sort of thing hardwired into the brain that's not ideological at all. Diana Rigg's character has a interesting response to all this, and the conclusion of this sort of third is unexpected. So I think the middle third is fine, but like I said, it's quite a change. And then the third is sort of back to the fast-paced again, but here we've got almost a murder mystery, or like maybe an episode of Columbo or something like that. So like I said, the movie is extremely uneven in its pacing, in sort of what it's about, but also it's ideologically uneven. So in the beginning, it might seem a little bit regressive, and whatnot. Like I said, it sort of satirizes these protesters. It sort of satirizes this Native American chief, sort of. But at the same time, the ideas, Diana Rigg's character, her thinking, the sort of new subversive vibes are given room to breathe in this movie, and actually end up being surprisingly influential with the way that the plot actually goes and whatnot. Pretty extreme and non-mainstream, non-standard thinking is actually given a pretty big platform on this movie, and not exclusively in a negative light and whatnot. So I wouldn't say that this movie is entirely regressive or anything. Like I said in the beginning, it just sort of seems to be hitting out at a lot of different things, and it seems to be quite unsure in itself where things are going. And I would say that this is one place where this movie does not really stack up to something like Network, which, although Network has a similar kind of thing where it's taking a snapshot of sort of the crazy world and whatnot, is just sort of a satire of a lot of different aspects of media and whatnot, and a lot of different players in the media, and a lot of different perspectives and whatnot. It still feels like it has some sort of ideological grounding or something like that. This movie maybe feels like the anchor chain broke loose and the ship is drifting. But this is not a bad movie by any means. There's some really nice parts of it that are quite edgy, right? So this is a dark comedy from the early 70s. Of course, it's going to have edgy, dark moments, and it absolutely delivers on that with some pretty funny ideas. There are some of the medical bungles that happen in the movie start to feel a little bit repetitious, I would say, but it has some clever slips, some clever basically satirical moments. I think the thing that will probably stick out most maybe today is a nice little scene they have about health insurance, which seems like it has aged really well, and whatnot. The movie in a lot of ways is extreme, I think. And I would say it's more extreme than something like MASH. And that goes for the gags and whatnot. These satirical moments are more extreme than you would expect and whatnot. Some of these sort of wild moments are more extreme than you would expect. Things are taken further than you would expect. And also some of the dramatic moments are more dramatic than you would expect. The George C. Scott's depression, his ravings, are more dramatic than you would expect. So a movie that's uneven and also extreme might sound like a bit of a mess. And really, this movie is, I think, a bit of a mess. But it's an interesting mess that at the very least will give you something to raise your eyebrow to a few times while you're watching it. And I think even more so, serves as an interesting document of the time, not in its documentary sense, but through what we can see about the film, right? I wouldn't say this movie is a great view of the reality. It's a great... not a great documentary about 1971, but on the other hand, I think it's a great document about 1971 that does capture a lot of the contradictions and interesting moments of the time. So I would say that in general, this movie is worth watching. Like I said, it has some nice sort of edgy satirical moments. It has good acting. In general, the script is pretty strong. Mainly, it's just uneven and a bit all over the place, ideologically speaking. Certainly not even-handed, certainly not really on sure ground, but also not really successful as just sort of an observational movie. But it is pretty wild, it's pretty unpredictable, and like I said, it gives new ideas more room to breathe than you would think, and it's more invested in them than you might expect, even if it's sort of just kind of satirizing them the whole time. But in general, this movie, The Hospital from 1971, a reasonable movie. Like I said, it's pretty interesting perspective. I'm not really aware of another medical thing that's like this. MASH would be sort of the closest, but even that is generally sort of successful and whatnot. This, in some ways, an anti-medical movie, but also an anti-subversive movie, and an anti-many, many different things movie that, like I said, is at least good for raising your eyebrows at, and at least has nice performances from Diana Rigg and George C. Scott, and has a nice script and some nice monologues written by Patty Chayefsky. So overall, a reasonable movie that I think could be worth your time. The Hospital from 1971.